And that's what I was blessed to be able to take into the academy. I was sharing with Ellen that my undergraduate advisor after I finished community college was none other than Stephanie Kuntz, who Evergreen, yeah. And I still believe Stephanie is the best historian in this country, other than Ellen, and no one can argue me otherwise. But Stephanie really taught me, again, academic, the principles of academic freedom, shared governance, but she also taught me why we're here. We're here for our students. We're here for our communities. And so I'm just really honored to be here on the panel and just excited. I've learned so much already, and I'm excited to learn even more. I was faculty union president. Many of you have read about our struggles in the state of Florida. And many of you know that a lot of we talking to Ellen about this. I mean, we're in the phrase existential crisis, I think gets used too much, but we're in a crisis of the republic. This republic is under siege, and let's just be clear, it's not going back to normal. There's no next election, things will go back to normal. There's no, what comes after. It's like, if we don't fight like hell to save democracy, to save what our students are trying to do, we're finished, and we have to learn to struggle together. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks everyone, and as you can see, we're in really good company. So I think what we'll do is start out, because this is lessons from history, I think we'll start out with Ellen, and she can kind of give us an overview here. And certainly, as we move along, don't be afraid to ask questions, and we're hoping for a really good dialogue and really good discussion in this salient topic. So Ellen?
I'd rather stand there, but you may not be able to see me. I'm used to being the smallest person in the room, so it's okay. Sure. Anyhow, what I'm going to be talking about is something that I guess is still relevant, even though I wrote this a few weeks ago. God in heaven, right? So it's about how administrators responded over time to political repression. And what are the lessons from history? Well, let's begin with number one. Academic administrators did not respond well to the campus protests of the past year. But then, you know what, they've never responded well to campus unrest or to external pressures to deal more harshly with political dissent. They almost always caved in. And during all my research on academic freedom in the McCarthy period and in the 1960s in particular, I could never find it more than, I don't know if I ever found any institutions that behaved well, ultimately. Anyhow, that's what's happening today. But at a moment when the opposition that the university is facing is, to put it mildly, so much more powerful, and the academic community is in such a much weaker position than it was in the past, that whatever administrators do may make no difference at all. Still, what we do know is that collaborating with political repression does not help. It facilitates it, right? It legitimates the assault on the autonomy of institutions, undermining the core principles upon which those institutions supposedly rest. So, in my remarks this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at how the universities responded to McCarthyism, as well as at the right-wing backlash against the student movement of the 60s, that both of which set precedents that we're still living with today. And I'm hoping that maybe somehow the current authorities can at least avoid repeating them, especially since what they're doing now doesn't work. Now, when McCarthyism developed in the late 1940s, universities employed, you know, what do we call it, the slogan du jour, as it were, anticipatory obedience. And they took measures to
see themselves as cultural change agents. So race consciousness becomes a critical part of this too. The second part of this is cultural nationalism, right? The idea that black spaces, again, matter, right? And that creating and carving out when I say black spaces, I'm not just talking about HBCUs, I'm talking about black businesses, right? I'm talking about black churches, I'm talking about black organizations, right? And all of this is being promoted through the creation of what so many scholars now refer to as race men and race women, right? People who took racial responsibility extremely seriously, right? They had a responsibility, a charge even, right? To lift up the race by creating and cultivating and supporting these spaces within these communities. And again, within these spaces, a litany of activists and scholars and movements ultimately are going to emerge, right? And then the third component of that is this idealism itself, right? And so one of the main primary sources that I consulted in my work were student newspapers, right? And because what do student newspapers tell us, right? They tell us who's on campus, right? They tell us, you know, what these students are thinking. Right? Many of these young folks are using student editorials, right, and writing their thoughts out, their angst, their frustrations, their angers with a white supremacist society. These are all things, by the way, that black youth were doing that so many people thought they weren't doing. Right? So the fact that this space was carved out and black youth in Mississippi in the 1890s can talk about the fact we need to get the hell out of here. Maybe we should think about going to Liberia. I mean, it provides them a space to work out their ideas, to imagine, like Andy Glauser, to imagine a world free of white supremacy, right? And there are very few spaces where that is going on. I always talk about black colleges, but I present them in the sense that they really represent two of the most important freedom pillars within the black liberation narrative. The first one being, of course, being the black church, right? And then the second one are HBCUs. Right? Which, again, HBCUs are created to train ministers and teachers. And so out of these institutions and spaces are coming these teachers who are investing and pouring in black youth, but there are also coming these ministers who are, again, opening up these spaces and creating spaces to continue this freedom work. So, but this idealism that emerges really emphasizes two things over and over and over again. Students are constantly being drilled in the ideas of democracy and citizenship. Democracy, and over and over and over again. Students are, again, it's the topic of these student editorials. They're bringing in speakers. I literally just finished writing a chapter on A&T and the legacy of that institution being a beacon for the freedom movement, and how do they respond to the campus being gerrymandered in 2016. And a speaker came to campus by the name of Harold Trigg, and Trigg comes on campus and he's involved in education, and he's talking about the fact that we should politicize these students. We should use these spaces to our advantage, right? And he's talking about democracy. He's talking about citizenship. Now, where else is that conversation going on in Black America in 1934 for black youth? Right? It's just not going on in a lot of spaces. And so the fact that idealism and cultural nationalism and race consciousness are being very much and deliberately and consciously discussed and elevated within these spaces, they absolutely matter. As you heard, I'm a professor of history at North Carolina A&T State University, and we're very proud of the fact that on February 1st, 1960, 4 freshman students, I got an Aggie in the house, by the way. Shout out to Wesley Lee. I just met him. And I'm going to come back to you in just a second, Wesley. But those 4 freshman students who launched this sit-in, and Professor Schrecker just mentioned this, HBCUs, and how inspirational they were in helping to launch the civil rights movement, and how that impacted so many white college students in PWIs, and how that brought forth the free speech movement and the anti-war movement. All of that is very much influenced by this activism that is unleashed on black college campuses. But again, I stand here before you to say, or sit here before you to say, that again, that's deliberate, right? There's a deliberate space being carved out where black youth are again, being exposed to these ideals, being taught to believe in themselves, and again, value the importance of these black spaces. And so that's the history and the legacy of these institutions. And that's how they very much play a critical role in shaping the movements that are going to emerge throughout the 19th and 20th centuries that ultimately challenged white supremacy, that challenged capitalism, that challenge all these isms that we're still struggling with. I'll very briefly talk about the importance of these spaces as they relate to labor. Again, from the very outset, black colleges are playing a critical role in advancing the freedom dreams of black folks, even as they war against capitalism, right? So by the time you look at the 20th century, the Student Negro Youth Congress, right, SNCC, the first SNCC, right, is going to be formalized on Howard University. Plays a critical role in advancing and launching the Southern Negro Youth Congress. They're bringing all these labor activists. Paul Robeson is on the lecture circuit. He's showing up at Howard. He's showing up at North Carolina A&T. They're showing up within these spaces, and it absolutely matters. I also want to deal with some of the complexities of HBCUs. When you look at the leadership of these institutions, many of them, and all the things that we talked about, that Ellen and Paul talked about, the stresses and the struggles of college leadership, black colleges were always under forms of repression, right? They were always being challenged in terms of their budget, right? They were always underfunded, right? And the pressure of these campus leaders, it was incredible in terms of being expected to constantly repress and suppress black student activism. But in 1940, a guy by the name of Jacob Reddix arrives on Jackson State University's campus. Jacob Reddix, of course, went on to become president of Jackson State University and infamously was seen as a tyrant on campus, right? He expelled the Ladner sisters. He was expelling tons of students. Margaret Walker hated his guts, right? And talked about him viciously in his diaries, referred to him as Uncle Tom. But it's the moment that he arrives in 1940, bringing ideas of creating co-ops, right? And he was celebrated by this, by people like John Hope and Du Bois, who celebrated his ideas of creating ideas on economic freedom that would help move and advance black people forward. So here's a gentleman, right, who does work on establishing and creating black co-ops, who is now president of Jackson State University in the 1940s and 1950s. He's recruiting and bringing in all these scholars and these activists, but it's the response of the segregationists in the 1960s when these sit-ins explode. When college campus explodes, to say, what in the hell are you all doing? Right? We thought that you were creating a space which advanced this idea, notion that black people were supposed to accept their second-class citizenship. But all of a sudden, you see black youth exploding out these campuses, and people are wondering what in the world has been going on within North Carolina A&T. What in the world has been going on at Southern University? What in the world have you all been doing at Jackson State University? And what they have been doing was exposing these students to the second curriculum, which ultimately unlocks this potential and this idea of how do we advance and continue to lift up these movements that push back against white supremacy and Jim Crow. And this is something that caught a lot of people by surprise. Septima Clark, who I'm sure many of you know this name. Septima Clark is in conversation with Solomon Say, who's a former activist in Alabama, and they're writing to each other, and they're both like, where in the world these sit-ins come from? And both of them are like, we don't really know, but we're happy that they're here. We're happy that young people have found their voice. But again, the response, the factor that really created this space the most was the idea of a second curriculum thriving and expanding on these college campuses. The other example I'll give is Felton Clark. Felton Clark is the president at Southern University in the 1950s and 1960s, and his father had been president before him. So you see a little bit of nepotism going to play. But I remember sending out my chapter on Southern University to a guy by the name of Professor Mack. And Professor Mack is a longtime professor at Clark Atlanta University in political science. And I actually kind of needled and poked fun of Felton Clark in the beginning, kind of suggesting that he was kind of Uncle Tom in some kind of ways. And I sent this out to Professor Mack at Clark Atlanta, and he actually was a student at Southern University in the 1960s, and ultimately was expelled by Felton Clark. But Professor Mack told me, Mack Jones, I'm sorry, it's Professor Mack, but it's Mack Jones. Mack Jones told me, he said, be careful in how you handle Felton Clark, right? Because before he made this turn in the 1960s, we saw him as a race man, Right? We saw him as someone who actually cultivated this space where we could actually, again, be exposed to all these litany of activists and speakers and labor organizers who would come and speak to us at Southern University. We understood and realized that, again, it was the pressures of the white supremacist state coming down on him that really forced him to expel and to be harsh with the students. And that's, again, coming from someone who actually was expelled by this man, kicked out. So I was kind of shocked that that was his response. So, of course, in the footnotes, I detail and talk about that. But it shows the complexities of these spaces and how they handled this particular moment. And then there's another example, and this, again, I'm coming back to you, Mr. Lee, of North Carolina A&T. Again, the sit-in start in North Carolina A&T, and Warmoth T. Gibbs is the president. And Warmoth T. Gibbs is under great pressure from the state of North Carolina to respond, right, to expel these students. He resists. He makes a decision to resist. And he very famously stated that here in North Carolina A&T, we teach our students how to think, not what to think. And they fire him anyway. But it's his ability to stand up in the face of that oppression, right? To say, no, I'm not going to expel, I'm not going to shut down this space, that continues to allow this sit-in movement to explode. And again, from February 1st to February 10th, we have this massive explosion that now includes all these HBCUs throughout the Deep South. And again, had it not been for that courageous act from Warmoth T. Gibbs, perhaps the level and the future of direct action in the protest would have been radically different. But I'm coming back to Mr. Lee, who told me he was a student in North Carolina A&T in the 1960s. And Mr. Lee, for years, has worked in housing advocacy in New York. And I asked him, I said, and this is just at lunch, I said, what role did being a student at A&T, or did being a student at A&T in the midst of this Black Power movement and Civil Rights movement, did it play any type of role in the work that you ended up going to do? And he almost stopped me mid-sentence. He said, absolutely. Right? So again, these spaces matter. Right? And when we cultivate and carve out in a very intentional and deliberate way spaces where we resist these white supremacist ideals and oppressions, we can unlock these freedom dreams of young people, or not, former young people, like Wesley Lee. You're still young at heart. But again, had it not been for you being exposed to that space, as you told me, your work trajectory, your life trajectory may have transformed, might have changed in a different way. So again, being intentional, and this is what HBCUs I think have done best. And in my work, I refer to this as communitas. I borrow a term from the term was a cultural anthropologist. This idea of being very deliberate in carving out this space where ritual can take place, where responsibility, social responsibility can take place, and young people can have a voice within a closed society. That's what HBCUs have represented the most, right? A space where Black youth could simply be, right? Where their freedom dreams could soar, where they could be exposed to this powerful counter-narrative, and in doing so, as I said before, uplift these social movements. And we need, and this is one thing, and I'll close here, but I think that the HBCU model has been so incredibly significant within higher education. I think there's so much that we can learn from it. John Hope Franklin, there's a story about John Hope Franklin, the eminent historian who taught at several HBCUs, was a product of HBCU. He was on faculty at Duke University. He was at a faculty meeting in the 1990s, and one of his colleagues, one of his white colleagues, was caught saying something disparaging about HBCUs. And of course, John Hope Franklin pops up in his seat. Wait, what, did I hear you say something about HBCUs? But he says in retort to this gentleman, HBCUs are the only model of higher education that have ever carved out space for the recognition of the humanity of Black people. And again, these spaces matter. They've mattered to the movement. And I think they still can matter. I hope they still can matter. Like so many, and hopefully we'll talk about this, these spaces have radically changed. As we undercut the humanities, as we undercut the social sciences, as HBCUs now also become corporate breeding grounds, it has threatened the ability of a second curriculum on these campuses. And so hopefully that's something that we can talk about as we continue to move forward, because I know the HBCUs are not alone. Google and Apple and all these military contractors are showing up on your campuses too. Right? So how do we reclaim these spaces in order to invest into this American project that we still that we still love, that we still want to see move forward.
Thank you, Jelani, Ellen, and Paul. Before we open it up for some discussion and some questions, I don't know if there's any follow-ups from Ellen or Paul.
Just so many ways, what we're seeing is so many ways to resist. And yet, there's so many people who are afraid. And I think one of the things we have to talk about as well is that kind of fear. Just one example that I don't even know has reached the media yet. There's an organization within the historical profession called the Berkshire Conference. It's women historians. It's not historians about women, it's women historians. And they have a big conference of women historians every 3 years. And usually it's held at a university. I've been to one at Smith, at Wellesley, at Rutgers. And this year, I forget where it was going to be. It may have been originally scheduled for Morehouse, I'm not sure. But anyhow, no university or college has agreed to host it this year.
One in the back, and then we'll get you to the front. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it's sort of a two-part question, piggybacking on the last thing that was said. To what extent, so I have a lot of fear, like I think you all do, about the ability of colleges and universities to stand up in the current moment. Academic freedom has been so eroded even leading up to the current moment. Do you think that HSBUs are better situated? Do you have optimism that they will stand up? And a related question for Paul, and this is maybe a little provocative. I'm a lifelong labor activist and lawyer, but the labor movement itself does have a history during the Cold War of having buckled under to these kinds of pressures. And personally, I'm optimistic that this round is going to be different. But what's your sense of the ability of the labor movement to stand up to the current fear and to not try to accommodate the current administration?
Let's do Jelani first.
So, one of the things that I think is so distinct about the HBCU model, and maybe not radically distinct, but certainly a large part of the defining narrative of these spaces are the use of what I talk about in my work, interstitial spaces. Right? Again, a space within a space. Right? What happens when an educator like Joanne Robinson, who's the president of the Women's Political Council at Alabama State University in the 1950s, what happens when she goes into her classroom and closes her door? Right? Or Margaret Walker goes into her classroom at Jackson State University and closes her door. That space then becomes hers. And she has a trust, and her students have a trust in her, and she has a trust in those students. And she begins to unlock, again, their potential, again, their freedom dreams. They feel comfortable within that space. That's what black colleges have really represented. And I think in many ways they still do. I have colleagues who teach at High Point University, which is 15 minutes, 10 minutes from Greensboro, North Carolina, who have been told that they can no longer use the words white supremacy or black or social justice in their classroom. Don't say, well, this is happening all across higher education, right? But one thing that I am extremely fortunate about is that when I go into my classroom to lecture on the history of the early civil rights movement, which is what I'm lecturing on this semester, I don't have students in my class videotaping me, right? Trying to catch me in a slipping up, right? You know, so black colleges, yes, I think in many, and I'm the director of a Center of Excellence for Social Justice, right? Which I know if this existed at High Point University or maybe at UNC Chapel Hill, we'll be under all kinds of pressure to, you know, why do we even have this space, right? So I think that HBCUs have indeed, is the title of my book, they have been shelters in a time of storm. And I think in many ways they still do provide a modicum of shelter and protection through the use of these interstitial spaces. Because we have black young folks coming to us who aren't worried about, are not under the pressure to say, hey, go capture your professor using these inflammatory words. They're coming to me saying, Dr. Faith, we need to know more. right? You know, we've been limited. We've been declined the opportunity to learn about these in our high schools, but now we come to your class, and you know, I've had students who come to me after class in tears because they've never been taught the history and legacy of lynching in America, literally. Right? Meanwhile, my students at High Point University, this is actual truism, right? This is just last year. My colleague, Paul Ringel, at High Point University, was teaching a class. All of the white students in his classroom, all of them, had never heard of Trayvon Martin. Let that sink in. As we think about why space matters and the silos that were created. These are white students in 2024, last year, who said they had never heard, who was Trayvon Martin? They had never heard of him. So the spaces that we're creating, the messages that we're translating for our young people, the lessons that we're delivering to our young people, it matters how are you using your space? Right? The space that you control, the space that is under your, and it's not just a classroom space, it's an office space, right? What book have you given somebody to read lately? Go read this, right? Go get inspired, go learn more. So I think that black colleges still provide a layer of protection for those. There are certain pressures that I'm not dealing with that many of my colleagues are. And so I'm hopeful about that, but I'm also very much acknowledging the fact that there's still all kinds of threats that exist with, that are targeting HBCUs, that are targeting all of our institutions.
The history of McCarthyism, the destruction of the IWW, the purge of left-led unions, in the 40s and 50s, these are catastrophes that still resonate today. But like you, I think that I'm very hopeful. I mean, the labor movement today, working with unions who are creating new types of contract articles to defend undocumented members, to defend LGBT trans members, this is really becoming just a very inspiring thing to people to just watch. So it is a new labor movement, and it does give me a tremendous amount of hope. The other thing that gives me hope, though, in terms of, you mentioned fear, Ellen and I participated, and I see several others participated in the American Historical Association conference in New York City in January. And Historians for Peace and Democracy, which I highly encourage anyone here who's not a member to join, but HPAT worked really hard in putting together a very specific, carefully worded resolution for the membership on Israeli scholasticide in Gaza. The Israeli destruction of Palestinian educational institutions, and whether or not AHA should make a statement about this, that, hey, destroying schools is not a good thing, okay? It was very carefully worded. It wasn't calling for a complete ceasefire. It was very specific on it did call for a ceasefire, but it was very focused on the destruction of educational institutions, okay? So we got it to the business meeting, which I'm told traditionally the business meeting of the American Historical Association consists of maybe like 50 members who come and attend. I've never been to one before. But this one was packed. It was absolutely packed. There were maybe 700-800 people there, right? Is that about right?
They couldn't get into the biggest ballroom in the hotel.
Yeah, it was.
And the fire department didn't let them keep more people around the sides.
And what was inspiring about this is that not only was there tons of people at the American Historical Association business meeting, they were our younger members. They were assistant professors. They were graduate students. I never even thought about going to an AHA business meeting as a graduate student, right? Didn't think it represented grad students. But these were grad students, and junior faculty were there by the hundreds. And we presented the resolution. I was one of the people that spoke in favor of the resolution. We had 5 colleagues who spoke against it. And the resolution was brought to a vote on the floor. It overwhelmingly passed. I think the vote is public record. I think it was about 450 in favor and 80 opposed or something like that. And so to me this represents a new moment in the American history profession. But what did our executive council do to the resolution? Well, they could have done one of 3 things, but they did the very worst thing. They vetoed it. They vetoed the resolution. And they could have sent it out to the general membership for a vote. They did not do that. If they would have sent it out for a general vote, it would have passed, again, overwhelmingly. But this kind of teaches, there's a few lessons here. The council, some members of the council spoke against the resolution on scholasticide and gossip because they said, if this passes, it's going to make the history profession a target. Imagine that. If this passes, it's going to harm K through 12 educators. If this passes, it's going to harm adjuncts. So they threw out every type of, I rather would they have just said, we don't want to pass it. Okay. But it gets back to what Ellen started us off with, anticipatory obedience, the same crap that I was taught as a graduate student. So whenever I talk to tenured faculty who are graduate advisors, who work with PhD students or MA or MFA students, I tell them exactly what Angela Davis told me as an assistant professor. Teach the scholars coming into your discipline to speak out. Because if they don't speak out, it puts pressure on the faculty of color and the students of color and the students at HBCUs to speak out, and it's not fair. Because if we're teaching our graduate students or our undergraduates, don't speak up until you get job security, until you get tenure. By the time you get tenure or job security, it's too late. You've lost your voice. And we have, I don't want to blame the victim here, but again, we've made ourselves an easy target for Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott and Marco Rubio. Because again, the great majority of the public support what we do. They know we're a jobs machine. My God, how many of us spend our weekends writing letters of recommendation for our former students? And I tell people, hey, graduate students is like having kids as a parent. It's a lifelong commitment. I'm writing job letters for graduate students I worked with 25 years ago, Ellen. And so, and so anyway, I better stop there. I can go on.
There were questions.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful presentations. I wanted to talk a little bit about fear, which is palpable. I teach across town at the Fashion Institute of Technology, which probably doesn't come to mind as the most radical place. Yet last year, the minuscule occupation or encampment lasted longer than Columbia, and sadly came to an end when the president of the college called in the NYPD, and it was disbanded. So what follows, and many of my colleagues told me that in the whole period of the encampment, which was minuscule on 27th Street, the only day that they feared for their safety was when the NYPD was storming the campus. So following that, this happened very late in the spring semester. Students who had been identified as members of this initiative received notifications in the early fall that they would be put through disciplinary proceedings. Now, the college embraced, a couple of years ago prior, this model of restorative justice, which we don't see very much now in place. Also, the code of conduct, or the, the code that rules the proceedings for disciplinary, calls for a maximum of 10 business days. So it's, pretty fast resolution to this. We still have students 10 months later who are fearing denial of visas, deportations, who still haven't, been in front of this. The composition of these tribunals, although it's spelled out in various codes, it's kept very secret. Anyway, I'm faced, because I'm also a union officer, with colleagues calling me because students are invited to bring character references, letters, or witnesses. They're living in fear of speaking up, just to the extent of saying, I know nothing about the student last year. They're currently my student. I've known them for 8 weeks. They show up on time. They are polite. They don't want to do it. So I think 13 of us decided to write a letter and sign it, because we figure that should be the beginning. And we wrote a very polite letter to the president of the college explaining that we were, as educators, we cared for the well-being of our students and keeping them in limbo for 10 months. Many of them haven't even told their parents that they are awaiting this, so the anxiety is palpable. We signed the letter. We got, particular answer from the president, but we signed with our names, affiliations. Of course, we are all tenured, the people who have signed the letter. But when we discussed our initiative on the floor of the Faculty Senate, one by one, people started contacting us. So sometimes it takes a kernel. The faculty member who spearheaded the initiative is somebody who comes out of Activism. So she became re-energized in this, and I feel that number one, there was a sense of pride that we didn't just sit back and wait for these kids to be expelled or whatever discipline. And also by example, people know that we can be trusted points of reference. And so we were talking about building a critical mass. Sometimes a small gesture like this kind of works.
Thank you for sharing that. Any follow-up to that?
I'm just so proud of you. That's just wonderful, really, and that's what we all have to do. So I'd like to hear more about how other people are dealing with
Good.
this.
We have time for a few more questions.
Yeah, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, Black Lives Matter movement, was polarized because of George Floyd, a black man murdered by a white cop. Many black men
Ward off what they assumed would be external attacks by policing their own institutions. And in particular, they embraced a notion that communists, so-called communists, were unfit to teach. I can quote you the president of Yale at the time. He said, there will be no witch hunt at Yale because we will have no witches. And he and his colleagues throughout academia based that determination on a very demonized portrayal of communists in the classroom. He said, and this was common throughout higher education, that communists were supposedly robots under Stalin's control who follow the party line. They indoctrinate their students and distort their teaching and research. Well, there was absolutely no evidence for this. And what's interesting is neither the congressional committees nor the college and university administrations ever looked into their teaching and research. In other words, the taint of communism was so strong that they could be fired anyhow. But it's important to realize that these people were not, quote unquote, innocent liberals. But they were people who had once been in or near the Communist Party at some point in the 30s and 40s. But they had refused to cooperate with the witch hunt. They were willing to talk about their own past political activities, but would not inform on other people. And so they took the fifth, which was, of course, pinning a target on their backs. But they had to, because it was the only way to avoid becoming an informer without being prosecuted for contempt of Congress. And what's interesting is their institutions could have ignored what these people did and their defiance of the committees, but every school that housed these unfriendly witnesses investigated them. And at least 100 people were fired and blacklisted, most of whom had tenure, and there may have been many more. And just as the academic community had adopted a consensus that communists couldn't teach, it did so with regard to professors who took the fifth. In the spring of 1953, for example, just as the main congressional committees are about to investigate higher education, a very important organization that you may or may not have heard of, called the Association of American Universities, You guys know it? Oh, well, you're very sophisticated. Anyhow, it's the presidents of the major research universities in America. They released a statement about how universities and their faculty should respond to the upcoming hearings. And in that statement, the AAU explained that professors who took the fifth were not only violating their obligations as citizens, but were also violating their professional obligations to preserve their university's reputations and reveal their political past. The AAU justified this newfound obligation of candor by explaining that because the academic profession claimed, and I quote, the fullest freedom to speak and the maximum protection of that freedom available in our society, professors therefore had to cooperate fully with the Inquisition, and their schools had to investigate them. In other words, name names or risk, you could be fired. And then the AAU printed 50,000 copies of this statement and disseminated them throughout the academic community. Naturally, these statements and the dismissals that accompanied them brought a chill to the nation's campuses. You know, professors censored themselves, they pruned their syllabi, they stopped teaching about controversial subjects, and they even changed their vocabulary. And a very well-known literary critic who I interviewed confessed to me that in his lectures he stopped using the word capitalism and instead talked about industrialization. And of course, there were no student political activities on campus. McCarthyism petered it out by the late 50s and the student movement emerged. It was propelled by the intensification of the civil rights movement that had been created by the students from historically black colleges and universities in the South. And after that, connected to that in fact, in the fall of 1964, there was the free speech movement at Berkeley, whose students demanded the right to engage in political activities on their campus. A few months later, the anti-war movement began, initially inspired also on the campuses by faculty teach-ins that spread to at least 100 institutions across the country. Soon, these protesters began to pay attention to what was going on their own campuses. You know, the collaboration of universities with the industrial defense industry, the war machine, and the demands for more students and faculty members of color. Most protests were nonviolent, but some got a lot, too much media attention. And administrators responded with confusion. They were simply, like today, caught off guard by the unprecedented unrest and were under considerable pressure to crack down on demonstrations. Those who took a hard line and refused to listen to their faculty members and students' demands, of course that's not happening now, usually worsened the crisis. Calling in the police almost always led to disaster, or at least unfavorable PR. And the unrest led to a backlash whose legacy affects all our campuses to this day. Ambitious right-wing politicians went into action. Ronald Reagan, the most successful of them, won the 1966 California governor's election by promising to crack down on the free speech movement at Berkeley. Politicians elsewhere were proposing measures to punish student protesters, and most significantly, they were beginning to cut appropriations to their public schools, colleges, and universities. What made what was already a dangerous situation worse was the economic crisis of the mid-70s that brought an end to the so-called golden age of American higher education, which was a period of massive expansion and seemingly unlimited public support. The nation's political elites were dealing with the economic crisis by adopting a neoliberal economic regime that sought to shrink the public sphere, including, of course, higher education. And university administrators responded to the ensuing austerity by restructuring the university and focusing, of course, on their bottom lines. They raised tuitions, ultimately leading to today's $1.6 or $1.8 trillion student debt crisis. They increased their dependence on federal funding and wealthy donors, while also adopting corporate business practices that essentially eliminate whatever was left of faculty governance. Most importantly, they hollowed out their faculties, gradually replacing full-time tenure and tenure-track professors with part-time and temporary employees. So that now more than 70% of the nation's instruction and research is in the hands of these poorly paid gig workers with no job security and thus no academic freedom. Over time, these and other measures undermine the educational quality of their institutions and further deprive them of public support, thus weakening the Academy's ability to defend itself against the toxic legacy of the conservative backlash against the 60s, which was a decades-long, lavishly funded, multi-pronged right-wing campaign against higher education that ultimately has led to the Trump administration's current blitzkrieg. Now, I don't have time to describe the elements of that campaign. Fortunately, the brilliant Duke historian Nancy McLean, in her 2017 book, Democracy in Chains, reveals that how a network of ultra-conservative billionaires and libertarian ideologues very self-consciously set out in the late 1960s to move the nation's political culture to the right, and to do so in part by destroying the influence of the liberal higher education within American society. So it's part of a bigger plot. To what extent the flabby response of the leaders of the Academy's most powerful and prestigious institutions contributed to the success of that campaign is unclear. But what is certainly the case is that the academic leaders from the late 20th century until the present failed to resist it. Either they didn't recognize how seriously the conservative culture war against higher ed was hurting their institutions, or else they lacked the will to stand up against it. It's probably both. Perhaps if they had understood that threat and spoken out strongly against it, as they could and should have, they might now be in a better position to resist it. So, what can the past teach us? Not much, unfortunately. Though the academic community now claims to regret its collaboration with McCarthyism, the only resistance to the witch hunt at the time came from the victims themselves and a tiny contingent of left-wing civil libertarians. Even liberal organizations like the ACLU and unfortunately the AAUP did not resist. So I don't think we're seeing an exact repeat of the Academy's collaboration with the forces of ignorance. There's more resistance today, even if it doesn't seem to exist among the university's top administrations. But even the most stalwart defenders of academic freedom have been taken aback by the speed, cleverness, and brutality of the Trump-Vance-Musk attack on the state the academic community and much of civil society, not to mention its most vulnerable members among the undocumented, etc. So we have to face the fact that it's much worse than it's ever been. But we can't give in to it. The situation is certainly not promising. And although a few important voices, like the president of Princeton, who is also the head of the AAU, are beginning to sort of criticize the cuts to research funding and the punitive economic sanctions directed against Columbia, they still support much of the illegitimate ideological agenda that undergirds the current war on higher education. Especially the demonization of higher education in every way, and since October 7th, the false narrative about anti-Semitism on the campus. And too many academic leaders are repressing legitimate protests on their campuses, scraping banned words from their course listings, somehow with the unrealistic, I think, expectation that it will somehow placate the forces of ignorance. Unfortunately, history shows that it won't. If these administrators really wanted to preserve their reputations, they must offer future historians another narrative, one that opposes the duplicity of the authoritarians and actually speaks truth to power. But they can't do it by themselves. Solidarity is essential, and I think that's one of the sort of key words that this conference is pushing. All of us, administrators as well, must work together to create a massive social and political movement within and beyond the academic community that overcomes our fears and fights for free expression, democratic self-governance, and the fate of the earth.
Thank you, Ellen. There's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end. Does anybody have any quick questions, though, for Ellen before we move on to Paul? Yes, sir.
I loved it at the end especially. As a faculty member, campus leader, how do we communicate to administrators that we want to engage in that solidarity with them when they are openly hostile to the very thing we're trying to do, is to help them make better decisions?
What do you think, Ellen?
I should start singing solidarity.
Yeah.
But, you know, we'll quote Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. We have to show that we do have the numbers, and we've got to turn those numbers into power. However we do it, obviously, unions are probably the most important single set of institutions we have to get that power, but whatever way works for you, use it. But don't do it by yourself. You know, find yourself an organization, create a new organization if need be, but strategize and always, please think about power. These people who we're fighting now have it, but we can organize it.
Thank you so much.
Anybody else real quick before Paul?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Do we need to stretch? Labor organizer in me feels like we need a stretch. We'll do a mental stretch. But Thank you again for having me. Thanks to Bill and the great staff for putting this incredible conference together. This is such an important time for us to be getting together to talk about solidarity, who our allies are, the need to work across the table. As I mentioned, I'm a former faculty union president, involved in a lot of negotiations. I've served in just about every committee one can serve on in a union, except for when I was president of the United Faculty of Florida UF. For some reason, my executive committee didn't want me messing with negotiations. So I respectfully stayed away from that because they did such a wonderful job. But I just want to echo as best as I can, I won't be able to do it successfully, everything that Ellen just taught us and shared with us. And some of my reflections in the labor movement, and I am going to talk about some of the history of campus protest and administrative responses to it. I mean, for me, it's a really personal topic because I came up through the labor movement and then started an academic career, students and faculty right away started looking to me to intervene, to help them, to represent them before administrators. I started doing this when I was a grad student at Duke University. Black students got together, were organizing incredible protests at Duke against a lot of racism on that campus. I mean, racism at Duke, go figure, right? But I saw right away the ways in which my colleagues in student affairs would oftentimes work to derail student protests. And this is something we have to recognize. This is something that Ellen asked us to talk about. Administrations, universities, say that they're in the freedom of speech business, academic freedom, intellectual freedom, and so on and so forth. But when their students step out of line, when our students step out of line, like, where are they? And so at Duke, there were protests, many of you remember in the mid-90s, and I would sit with the students and just listen to them. Dr. Alex Berg, who's a great professor at Rice, we were both grad students back then, and so we would hang out with the undergrads and just listen to them talk about their desires to change the institution, what they hoped that Duke could become. And, after they started getting some traction, and they would have hundreds of African-American Duke undergrads come to these protest meetings, and a lot of allies, too, off of campus especially. Duke kind of got a hold of it, and they called in all these counselors. They started having focus groups. They started breaking students up. They said, it's not productive to have groups of more than 10 people. So we want you in small groups, right? So I went through all that. But history, and then when I taught at UC Santa Cruz, the person who taught me how to intervene on behalf of students who were engaged in dissent was Angela Davis. And I would go with Angela, or she would take me to meetings with administrators at UC Santa Cruz to help prevent our students involved in dissent and protest, and this is in the early 2000s, how to keep them enrolled in school, if they wanted to stay enrolled in school and not being expelled or kicked out. Very useful skill, by the way. And so Angela taught whole generations of junior faculty how to do that. And the big thing was to stroke the administrators' egos, to make them feel good, right? To make them feel like they were in charge. And please don't ruin the student's life because they spray painted a solidarity message on the side of a building, okay? So the deeper history dive I want to do, though, is to remind us that, and I'm going to talk about 4 kind of moments of academic freedom, suppression of academic freedom on campuses, and what ties these 4 different moments together. And the first moment is during the progressive era, 1910s. Second era, 1960s. Third is the BLM resurgence, Black Lives Matter resurgence, 2017 after. And then this newer moment of the Palestinian solidarity movement. The thing that ties all these things together, and Ellen, when you were talking, it just finally, you got through to me. You educated me, and I realized the thing that ties these 4 movements of historical protest together, they all dovetailed and connected with labor and working class insurgencies, every single one of them. So in the progressive era, you may be familiar, some of you, with the long and august history of Columbia University and academic freedom, and a guy by the name of President Butler, Nicholas Butler. And what he tried to do, and then his friend Woodrow Wilson tried to do in terms of academic freedom. And by the way, the lesson here is never ever elect a former university president to be president of the United States. Really for this republic, and we still haven't recovered yet. We have not recovered from the Espionage Act of 1917. It still governs how a lot of us approach politics. Fearful, even before McCarthyism. So anyway,
we're just gonna grab the trash real
during
quick.
Butler's administration in Columbia, and many of us know, he tried to clamp down on academic freedom. Charles Beer, probably the nation's most authoritative historian at the time, resigned. John Dewey was involved in this. Franz Boas was involved in this in Columbia. But President Butler's idea of academic freedom was so impoverished, it's hard for me to even, he talked about it, but he didn't agree that you had the freedom to advocate for women's suffrage. He didn't agree that you had the freedom to advocate for the industrial workers of the world. He didn't believe that people who were what he called quote-unquote sexual deviants should have freedom at all, right? And so when Wilson got elected, fast forward, this is a Cliff's Notes version, the Espionage Act was really aimed against the progressive movement. And the crackdowns on academic freedom on campuses all across the country, from University of Washington to Columbia, during World War I, and you remember, historians remember the preparedness movement, right? And if you weren't involved in the preparedness movement, which everyone knew Wilson wanted to get the U.S. into World War I, right? And so the Espionage Act was designed to crush any dissent against the U.S. going into World War I. It was also designed to crush the industrial workers of the world. And it was also designed to crush the progressive movement. So that's case study one. Again, attacks on academic freedom are attacks on the whole republic. Our allies are our communities. And coming from a working class background, where I'm the first person in my family to graduate from university, I can tell you that my working class, like elders and families and stuff like that, they're on our side. They are not opposed to us. They want us, they want the students in our institutions to thrive in community colleges, in research universities, in teaching schools, et cetera, et cetera. So case study number two, the 1960s. Many of us know the freedom of speech movement. My advisor, Stephanie Kuntz, was a leader of that movement. But we always forget that was also another moment of working class and union insurgency. That was the moment in the 60s and 70s of a lot of the, UIW for democracy, Steelworkers for democracy, and so the crackdown on academic freedom then was also connected to a crackdown on the labor movement, okay? Case study three, the Black Lives Matter resurgence after the election of Donald Trump, and especially in 2020. Now, this was an amazing moment. I've written about this. We have a new edition, the fourth edition of Who Built America, which is, by the way, completely free online right now, in the beta version, and a lot of professors in labor and socialists are using it. But the chapter I wrote, I was asked to write that blog to the new edition of Who Built America. And so they said, write about the first Trump administration. Thanks a lot. Everyone else gets to write about anarchism and, the CIO and the sit-down strikes, and I get to write about Donald Trump. But it was really educational for me because, my wife and I, Sheila Payne, who many of you know, participated in a lot of these movements after the election of Trump. And it was a time of incredible, again, labor and working class insurgency. And that connects to what's happening now with the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. Another time of crackdown on academic freedom, again connected to labor and working class insurgency. The students I work with across the country who set up encampments in solidarity with the besieged people in Palestine, I have to remind them sometimes, something their administrations don't acknowledge. I tell them the majority of American people are with you. My working class, my family in the working class in like San Antonio, Houston, El Paso, they are with you. Latinos have supported an immediate ceasefire in Gaza by pluralities of like 84 to 90% from like November of 2023. So the people are with the students. The workers, by and large, are with the students. So we need to ask ourselves, why is it that administrators pretend that they're defending the integrity of the institution by calling in police to sweep out student protests? I can give you a number of anecdotes. I write a lot of letters on behalf of students who are trying to transfer to different schools. Some of them from Columbia, because they're just fed up. But the thing I noticed, I'll give you two examples. The university I teach at now, Cornell, before I even stepped up foot on campus, they called the Ithaca City Police to deal with the protesters, to sweep them off campus. How did the Ithaca City Police respond? They didn't want to have anything to do with it. Gainesville, Florida, the same thing. When you have contacted the city police to sweep those students out, they didn't want to have anything to do with it because they know that people are on the side of the students. They know that the working class, broadly speaking, and again, there are differences, right? I understand that. But these are popular insurgencies that some universities have set themselves against. And the reason I mention that is to kind of give us some hope. The people are on our side. We do have to explain, when we use terms like academic freedom and tenure, how those things benefit our surrounding communities. And we also have to talk about how our universities have habitually exploited our sustaining and surrounding communities by paying miserable starvation wages, not just to adjunct faculty, but to custodians, to maintenance workers. And when we do things like that, when we build these bridges, we're going to get even more support. I'll mention, kind of in closing, an activity that I think I shared with Bill before in a panel in a past collective bargaining conference. In 2023, Ron DeSantis, our governor, who has a lot of ideas about unions, by the way, but again, is very unpopular. The only reason the guy wins the elections is because the Democratic Party in Florida is so disorganized, so badly disorganized, don't even get me started on that. So Ron DeSantis, many of you know, he banned the advanced placement Black Studies curriculum a couple of years ago. So when I was still in leadership at United Faculty of Florida, students from South Florida called us and said, would the union support a statewide walkout of college students and high school students walking out in support of Black Studies? And I said, I'll get back with you. And 10 minutes later, I had an answer. Yes. This is the power of collective bargaining and of unions. Because our members could know that they could participate in a controversial activity because we had collective bargaining. And our academic freedom article, and I know Bill has heard me say this ad nauseum, was created by, many of the people that created our academic freedom article in the 70s were survivors of the Pinochet regime in Chile. And so for them, a union contract means academic freedom. Everything else is tertiary, I was going to say secondary then tertiary, but tertiary and secondary, right? So we could participate in a Black Studies teach-in. That's what a lot of our campus units decided to do. At the University of Florida, we organized a teach-in, our science librarians on Black Studies. Our science librarians, the only condition that they put on us, and by the way, they're union members also, they said, we just have to, Paul, connect it to research, teaching, and service. So we need to involve the community. We need to make, as part of the teach-in, we need to share with people the incredible richness of the archives of Black Studies that the University of Florida has, okay? Wow, that's really a harsh condition. Oh my God, are you kidding me? So we did a teach-in, and it was the most, I've been involved in a lot of teach-ins back in different anti-war movements, and it was the most inspiring teach-in I've ever been involved in. It focused on Black Studies. It started with a walkout all across the state. You may not have heard about this, because corporate media loves to talk about how we're victims but they never talk about when we have these breakthroughs. Like some of my colleagues here don't even know, we still have a temporary injunction against the Stop Woke Act in Florida. But you know how we got that temporary injunction? We spoke back. And the federal court, Judge Walker said, well, to Governor DeSantis, he said, basically, I have enough evidence here to say that there's a lot of people who think that racism is still a big deal. Because they're doing research on it, they're teaching about it. So you can't tell me that we're post-racial. But it was only because, we only got that injunction against the Stop Woke Act because we talked back. If we had been silent, if we had done what Ellen had warned us against, anticipatory obedience, which some of our administrators think is going to save us, it never saves us. Those of us who grew up in shipyard towns know what happens when you give in to a bully. They just bully you more and more and more. But the final thing I'll share about that teach-in was it was so cool because I didn't even know, and I should have known this, but my science library colleagues told me, and it was a 5-hour teach-in on Black Studies. 5 hours. Hundreds of people attended from the community, from the staff, the students, et cetera, et cetera. But what the science librarians told me after we'd finished was, they said, well, Paul, you know the deal. Student affairs came. And before they even set up the Black Studies teaching in the library, the student affairs people came up to the science library staff and said, well, you know, it may be better not to engage in this activity because it's kind of controversial and the state may not like it. And they're just, and I don't want to make fun of them because they're doing their jobs, or they see that they're doing their jobs. But our science librarians said, we're union members, and it's our right to do this, and it's going to benefit the students, and it's going to benefit the communities. And the majority of people are on our side. So thank you very much, and they're very polite, I'm sure they were, as science librarians always are, right? And so we got to do our teach-in on Black Studies. But we got to do our teach-in on Black Studies because of collective bargaining, because of a really superb academic freedom article, because of the support of our communities, because our union, the faculty union at UF, and I'm sure many of you can second me on this, we've never seen the union as being just about our own membership. If there's a higher wage struggle, if there's an affordable housing struggle, if there's a struggle against transphobia, if there's any kind of struggle in Gainesville, Florida, when I lived there as union leader, we were going to be involved in it. We were going to go give testimony, we're going to be supportive, because when the wolf comes for us, we need that support. So again, in closing, I'll say that, you know, the people, the Republic is on our side. And you see the fight backs, they're happening everywhere. And I just hope that our universities kind of catch up to history. Thank you very much.
Oh, I should have went first. Greetings, everybody. I had the great fortune recently to be featured in a documentary put together by Henry Skip Gates. And it featured several historians talking about the legacy of, first of all, the title of the documentary is called Making Black America. We talked about the importance of cultivating black spaces. And Eddie Glaude was featured in this documentary series as well. He talked about the significance of imagination spaces, particularly as it relates to the history of the Black liberation movement, carving out imagination spaces. And that's what the legacy of black colleges represent. I never take it for granted when I have the opportunity to speak before audiences that people are intimately familiar with historically black colleges and universities. So let me very briefly just sort of go over why these spaces matter, right? For the last 5 years, we've talked about Black Lives Matter, and they do, but I'm here to testify that black spaces have also mattered. And the presence of these black spaces have been critical to not just advancing the freedom dreams of black people, but moving forward American democracy. We need them now more than ever. The first HBCU was founded in 1837 in the midst of the Jacksonian era. It's founded right inside of Philadelphia. It's called the Institute for Colored Youth. And from the very outset, it's very clear that black colleges are going to represent a radically different alternative than the Yales and the Harvards and the Michigans and the Stanfords of the world. It's very clear that they're going to connect their curriculum and their spaces to advancing black people within this country, as opposed to these other institutions which have played a critical role in not just advancing white supremacy, but creating white supremacy. And so the Institute for Colored Youth is now called Cheyney State University. Again, it's the first HBCU. It's now located right outside of Philadelphia. But in 1871, and I opened up my book talking about this narrative, in 1871, Octavius Cato, who was a former student at the ICY, but also ultimately taught at the ICY, is assassinated in the streets of Philadelphia. Why is he assassinated? He's murdered for the role that he and his students have been playing in advancing the 14th and 15th Amendments. Right? And so again, it's very, very clear from the outset that black colleges make no qualms whatsoever about not just educating their students, but also politicizing their students, unlocking their intellectual talents and their tools to address white supremacy in America. And this goes on for the next 100 to almost 200 plus years now. We're at 1837, almost getting ready to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the creation of the first HBCU. But we would be here for weeks if we spent time going down the pantheon of history and listing all of these incredible race men and race women who are products of this space that was created. Again, Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, Thurgood Marshall, Ella Baker, all the people that we lionize and celebrate, rightly so, most of them, almost all of them, were products of HBCUs. And so when you begin to examine that history, we also have to ask the question, this is one of the things that I try to do with my research, how, right? Why, right? What are the ingredients that actually go into creating someone like Ella Baker? And so in my work, I talk about the significance of this, what I refer to as the second curriculum. That HBCUs were literally trying to model themselves off of the Harvard and Yale model. They're teaching history, they're teaching Latin, they're teaching Greek, they're teaching all of these same fields, but there's a second curriculum that thrives within these spaces that make these institutions radically different. And again, this second curriculum speaks to the freedom dreams of black folks within this country. It's composed of three ingredients. The first one is the idea of race consciousness. Right? James Weldon Johnson attended Atlanta University. He said, when I arrived at Atlanta University, everything focused on race. Right? It was the focus of oratorical contests. We talked about it in our classrooms. We had visiting speakers come. They always talked about lifting up the race. Right? How do we advance the race in the midst of such oppressive society that we're locked in? So race consciousness became this very important counter-narrative. Right? How do you take black youth in the 19th and 20th centuries while America is increasingly embracing white supremacy, codifying Jim Crow, right? Creating these barriers? How do you create a space where black youth can go and understand that you have a culture, right? You have a place within the society. You're not a Sambo. Right? You're not a pickaninny, right? You're not destined to be a second-class citizen. It's critically important that you inject this environment with race consciousness so these young folks can believe in themselves,